Are you concerned about the fact that in our country, we can't just have a conversation respectfully anymore? Are you concerned that every time you turn on the news, you're completely bombarded with opinions and spin? Are you concerned about the future of our country, your community? Then it's time to circle up.
Circle up is about having real conversation.
The first obligation of a citizen is to be civically engaged. If you keep allowing other people to shape your world, they will keep doing so without your input.
Policy Circle definitely makes me feel challenged because it pushes you to definitely step out of your comfort zone and to bring others along with you.
It's about building relationships, learning to communicate, learning to relate, learning to collaborate. It's about taking ownership of solutions.
What do you want to do? Where do you want to see our country grow, our world grow? And let's help each other fix it and make it better.
What I thought was remarkable about my first Policy Circle experience was that people were genuinely listening. They had an open mind and they were willing to be transparent. And policy suddenly became about so much more. It was personal. It was about our families, our communities, our businesses. It seemed relevant and refreshing.
When you unpack the word policy, you're just going to find community. We already talk about policy casually, informally, but the Policy Circle suggests that we talk about it with intention, with some guardrails, with a framework, so that we walk away more educated, not so frustrated.
The Policy Circle briefs give you a global perspective. They help you understand the things that you would not necessarily see on CNN or Fox News.
It's about listening to one another. That's why I circle up.
It's a lot of supportive women working together, and everybody's different. Economically, socially, racially, everybody's different. Everybody wants different things, and I like that.
That's why I created the Policy Circle. It's about our voices.
Civic duty starts here.
Whether my business prospers or not, starts here.
Building your confidence to speak up, to be part of your community, starts right here.
Well, good evening. Welcome to the Policy Circle, Move the Needle, Rebuilding Trust. I'm Stacey Blakely, the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Policy Circle, and I want to welcome you. Tonight's event is exclusively for the supporters of the Policy Circle. Thanks to your support, in spite of 2020, the Policy Circle has continued to grow and thrive. And tonight we're focusing on trust. And while we will delve into the challenges and the ramifications of COVID-19, civil unrest, and now a tumultuous election cycle, our goal is to identify ways we can rebuild trust in our neighborhoods and communities, and really rebuild trust in the institutions that comprise a vital, thriving, democratic society. Many of you on this call have already participated in a poll that we sent out via email. There's also a link that I think is scrolling here. And so you can still participate and tell us about your level of trust in both the federal and state government. And we'll explore those results in just a few minutes. Also, if you have a question, we would love for you to type that into the chat because we will have some Q&A at the end of our fireside chat. Now, the basis for tonight's Move the Needle, like any of our programs at the Policy Circle, is a Policy Circle brief. The brief on rebuilding trust is very unique and timely. One of the definitions that you'll find in the brief is that trust is the basis upon which the legitimacy of government is built. I think we can all agree there are quite a few conversations these days about legitimacy and trust. And I think it's interesting to note that in 1964, 77% of the people surveyed said they trust the government. Now in 2020, we see that is at 20%. I encourage you to take a look at the brief if you haven't already. It was emailed in the link, and really delve into some of the sources and the analysis of the state of trust. 2020 Gallup poll showed for the 14th year in a row, Congress was the lowest ranked institution, with only 6% of Americans saying they had a great deal of trust, 46% saying they have very little or no confidence. So we have some of your poll results, and they mirror this pretty closely. 0% of you said you had a high level of trust. 28% of you were neutral, and 87% saying they had a low level of trust right now in our federal government. If you look at state level of government, the trust is slightly higher. You'll see that 54% of Americans said that they trusted their state and local government to do what is right. So let's look at your poll results. 18% of you said that you had a high level of trust in your local and state government. 82% were neutral, and interestingly enough, 0% of you said you had a low or 0% level of trust in your local government. The brief also explores trust in vital institutions, such as law enforcement, the scientific and academic communities, the media, and the impact of the coronavirus. But most importantly, the brief and our conversation tonight is focused on making sure that you leave this conversation better equipped, with more understanding of how we can rebuild trust and renew hope in our country. I cannot wait to hear from our speakers tonight what they have to say about this multifaceted topic. I'd like to welcome Heather Nauert. Heather's a dear friend and collaborator of the Policy Circle. She brings the perspective of both a journalist and a diplomat, having served as a communications director for the State Department and now a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Jason Riley is also a friend of the Policy Circle. He's an opinion columnist for the Wall Street Journal and a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Jason and Heather, delighted to have you both with us tonight. Jason's coming from just outside of New York, and we've got Heather just outside of DC. And again, thank you guys for sharing your evening with us, and I look forward to hearing your conversation. And Heather, I'm gonna let you take it from here.
All right, Stacey, thank you so much. Jason, it's great to see you again. And I would like to first and foremost thank Sylvie for pulling this all together. The mission of the Policy Circle is so important, and it's something that's really near and dear to my heart, and that is enabling people to have constructive conversations and learn from one another, even though we may not always agree on any given topic. I think we can all agree, though, that this year has been extremely challenging in a lot of ways. The Policy Circle brief on rebuilding trust initially came out in the summer, and Jason and I had the good fortune of being able to talk with some of you about that initial brief. And Jason, at the time, I remember this was not long after the tragic death of George Floyd, we thought, you and I did, it would be so difficult for trust to erode much more than it had at that point. And here we are today questioning the election results, questioning the sanctity of one's ballot, of course, police and institutions. I leave you with that right now. And how did we get to this point where things have become such a challenge?
Well, you're right. It's hard to believe that things could have gotten worse than they were over the summer, and somehow they have. And I think it's probably indicative of a broader erosion of trust in institutions per se that we've been seeing. It's steady, but there is a pattern. There's a trend line that you can see from the policy briefs, and this has been noticed by others that we've been moving in the wrong direction as a country of late on the issue of trust in institutions. One thing that's very striking, just to take this pandemic that we're all going through right now, if you really want an example of how bad things have gotten, I saw a poll today or yesterday that said that something like 4 in 10 people in New Jersey will not take the coronavirus vaccine once it becomes available.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about that. This is it's a blue state. It's a large state with a lot of people in it. And yet on the issue of the pandemic, we have people who simply don't trust the science. It's been politicized. I mean, this is the issue of our day, the issue of our lifetimes.
Yeah.
No one alive today has experienced anything like this. And yet the issue of whether to wear a mask or socially distance or travel for Thanksgiving or take a vaccine. 4 in 10 in New Jersey. I mean, I think that's sort of indicative of where we are today.
Yeah, that's such a good illustration point. And that brings me back to the graphic that Stacey put up about the percent of people who say that trust in the federal government to do what is right is there most, if not always. The high 1964 at 77%. But if you look at that pattern, and I'm sure a lot of the folks here are familiar with looking at patterns and trends and everything, you see that it really declined after the Vietnam War or during that period. It really declined in the 80s, and perhaps that was in line with the stock market crash. It was up in the early 2000s at the turn of the century, so going well, and then we've been on this steady decline really ever since. And I'm just kind of wondering, what is that about? Is that about 24/7 media? Is it about any one thing that our politicians have done? Is that the way that we all talk to one another and how we communicate? What are your thoughts on that, Jason?
I think since 2000, I've mentioned a couple things since 2000. One is the election of 2000. And it began a trend that involves politically the winner of the popular vote and the winner of the Electoral College. There's been a sharp divergence in several elections since 2000. I think that has been a factor in this. We've also had the Iraq War issue that has happened since 2000 and post 9/11, weapons of mass destruction and so forth. So I think all of that has led to has fed this distrust. And lastly, I would blame my own profession, and I think we can probably delve into this a little bit more as the conversation progresses. But the media, the media has really changed in a way that for insiders is probably less confusing than for outsiders. And by that I mean there used to be more of a firewall between news and opinion in this country. And it was always understood by the insiders that the political media, at least, leaned left. Polls have been taken back to the 1970s and 80s, showing that a lot of the White House press corps leans Democratic. We have that data. We can show that politically. We can show that empirically, I should say. But there was still something of an effort in the reporting to distinguish between when, this is straight news and this is opinion. And I think that line has really, really blurred. And social media certainly...
It's more than blurred. I think it's been blown up. I think a lot of folks watching...
I was trying to be a little delicate, but
would frankly agree with that. Jason, I'm frankly astounded as a former journalist and then a government official who worked with a lot of journalists to read journalists' Twitter feeds. And the Twitter feed for a straight news journalist is just filled with opinion. And there was a time in our country...
Twitter feed. They are tweeting as White House correspondent for the Washington Post or the New York Times. This is not, they've made no demarcation between their personal views and their views as a journalist. And yes, I think, the idea that you would go Twitter crazy or crazy on Facebook and then show up the next day and say, I'm going to write a straight news piece about this press conference with the president, people are sort of saying, come on, we know what you really think here, and how is this not affecting your day job? And so I think that has also led to an erosion of trust in the media. And again, people get their information by and large from a lot of these big media outlets. And so to the extent that people don't trust those outlets as much, people don't trust other institutions as much.
Jason, to that point, and you in the newspaper business know this as well as anyone, there used to be really strong editors. And editors would take a look at what you did to make sure that it was fair and that it was accurate and that your sourcing was correct and spot on. And even if you used an anonymous source, you would have to tell your editor who that was and why, and argue why it was necessary to leave someone's name out. I wonder what happened to that business where editors don't play that role anymore. They don't slap your hand and say, Jason, you're a reporter. How can you be opining on Twitter? What happened?
Well, in my experience, and I've been at this for about a quarter century now, what happened was Donald Trump. And you had major news outlets.
A lot, years before that.
But you had major news outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post come out and blatantly say, we are going to cover this president differently.
Yes,
we covered
yes.
previous presidents.
Yeah.
The old rules don't apply in terms of sourcing quotes, in terms of anonymous quotes, in terms of calling someone a liar. The old rules don't apply. And they made a conscious effort to cover this president differently. And I think they have dug themselves into a hole here. And it's going to take some time for them to get out of it, to rebuild this trust to the extent that they had it before. And as I said, it's been eroding for some time. But I think you had a lot of journalists, running around with their hair on fire for the past 4 years. And the question is, will they ever be able to get back to what, how it used to be pre Donald Trump in terms of how we cover a White House?
And so let me pause you there for a second, because that really ties in with one of the polls here in the policy brief, and that is 84% of Americans believe the news media is essential to democracy. That's correct. But at the same time, trust in the media has been falling consistently over the past 2 decades. So we've talked about sort of the erosion of accountability in terms of bosses not keeping reporters straight. We've talked about how aghast many reporters were at the idea of a Trump administration. How can we start to demand more of these institutions? Let's just take media right now.
Well, I think the news media is a business that needs customers, and if those customers don't trust the source, they'll move on. And one of the some of us who are old enough can look back and remember when we had 3 news anchors at the major networks giving the nation the news. For me, it was Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings and Dan Rather, and that's what most people tuned into. And then this cable news stuff came along, and those 3 guys were no longer the oracles for the entire country. And there, that was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you had the nation turning into 3 people, and we were all on the same page in terms of the information we were receiving and processing. And in that post 3 network domination, you have people going off in different directions, whether it's cable news and now today Twitter or Facebook, social media in general, and now there's less commonality in the reality that we're all perceiving. So we have a lot more of talking past one another because we're not receiving our news from the same sources anymore. So it's been a double-edged sword. And so the question is, who is trustworthy? who going forward will people tune into and say, I can believe this, and I don't need to listen to what these other sources are saying because I found a trustworthy news source. And that will be the major question going forward. And that's why I think it was such a travesty for the news business in general to change the rules to cover Donald Trump. I don't know how they're going to gain back that trust going forward. We'll see.
I think it's a real crisis in that profession. And nowadays we're seeing if someone doesn't like how an entity, a news channel reports something, they can so easily turn the channel and just go somewhere else to hear something that's even more skewed to the way they want to hear it, whether it's the left or the right. And as a conservative here, and I worked for Fox News for many years, I've watched how people who really believed in Fox News as an entity, and I know their standards, I'm very familiar with them, but how they have been called into question over decisions about Arizona. So I think we have to continue having this conversation about who do we trust and where can we go to get accurate information, and also a place where we can go to hear varied viewpoints and not just what we may want to hear.
Yeah. That's the big question of today. I think that the metaphor people use are silos. We all receive our information in these various silos, and we're not looking at other people's silos. So we turn. So to put it more simply, the problem is not watching Fox News or watching CNBC or CNN. It's watching only Fox News or only CNN, and that's where we seem to find ourselves today, and that is a problem. You have to understand where other people are coming from if you're going to rebuild trust. Yes, there's going to be some cynicism out there, but you do need to make a good faith effort to say, this other person is on the up and up. I need to stop thinking about their supposed ulterior motives and take their argument at face value and say, is there any merit? Is there any merit to this? Where are they coming from? How do they differ where I'm coming from? And this ability to really streamline your sources of information make you less likely to do that. Mm-hmm. And frankly, it probably makes it a little harder to do that.
Mm-hmm. I will pass this on along to my husband, because the only news source he goes to is the Wall Street Journal. even for his music recommendations. Though, in fairness, I do think that the Wall Street Journal is really the best source of information, because you can go to your news side and then go to your opinion side. And I find that it can challenge you as a reader to think about different sides. But one of the things that you're really hitting on is, how do we define trust? And we define that through honesty, through fairness, through purpose, and through vision. And part of that means knowing that our leaders, whether it's in the media or in the US government, will put our interests first and will listen with purpose and understand how and why we feel about any given problem or situation that our country is facing right now.
Yes, and that brings us obviously to the recent election and what just took place, mm-hmm. And people trusting the results. On the one hand, I think a lot of us saw this coming, in terms of the election results and how it would play out. We knew that a lot of Democrats were voting early. Mm-hmm. The pollsters told us that was going to happen. We knew a lot of Republicans were planning to vote on Election Day. That was something that Donald Trump encouraged you to do. And so we knew that on Election Day, what would happen is that the people who voted on Election Day, their votes would be counted first. They would be disproportionately Republican, and they would run up those numbers. Mm-hmm. And then as we started counting the early votes over time, particularly in those upper Midwest swing states, who couldn't start counting votes until Election Day. That Republican lead would slowly diminish. And the fear was that the president would say, oh, wait, I was ahead. I'm losing my lead. Something fishy is going on, and take it from there. And so here we are. That's exactly what has happened. You compound that with the distrust in these institutions that has been building for decades, and now you have the president of the United States saying, "I don't trust the election results either." He got a lot more votes than he did last time, even if he didn't get as many as his Democratic opponent. So there are a lot of people in this country who don't trust those results, and then you compound that with the fact that we still have this undecided Senate ballot.
Let's hold on that point for just one second, because that's a whole nother animal, but a really, really important one. When you talk to Republicans following the election, the numbers are off the charts. 70% of Republicans say they do not believe that the 2020 election was free and fair. Prior to the election, 35% of Republican voters said they thought it would be free and fair. On the flip side, you talk to Democrats, and the vast majority say that it was in fact free and fair. So I mean, perhaps it's no surprise there. The one who loses did not believe it was a free and fair election. But let's contrast that with some of the reports that we have read. Ballots being found in the middle of the night, ballots that were only just found yesterday in other states, an entity that was in charge of counting votes, but yet it was housed overseas. So how are we now supposed to make sense of all these very different kinds of stories that frankly sound suspicious, but we can't figure out who to believe?
Well, I think you're always going to have irregularities in elections, particularly in a nation the size of the U.S. And you combine that with the pandemic and the way people were voting this time. It's been an election unlike any other. I think the real difference, however, this time has been the president of the United States sowing doubt in the results, and not simply after Election Day, but leading up to Election Day. And the fact that he has so many followers, and that the country was already so deeply divided politically. Donald Trump won around 63 million votes in 2016. He's well over 70 million this time. So there's a large chunk of the electorate that believes in Donald Trump, voted for Donald Trump. And when he says, don't trust these results, they are very, very willing to go along with that.
To be fair, however, and we've got a lot of ground that I know we want to cover before our time is up, but to be fair, there are cities like Philadelphia and cities like Chicago where, a lot of really dodgy stuff happens. Like ballot box stuffing, dead people voting, all of that. So I think Americans are correct in being concerned about voter fraud. But perhaps the outstanding question is, to what extent was there voter fraud, in fact, in this election? And that's
I don't think the question is to what extent there was a voter fraud. It is to
was it enough to move the needle?
Was it enough to move the needle? And also, I mean, part of what is necessary to believe that there was a grand conspiracy is to remember what happened down ballot to Republicans. So you'd have to believe that Democrats somehow managed to defeat Trump, but increase the numbers of Republicans in the House of Representatives, increase state legislative majorities for Republicans in a redistricting year, when it is very important to hold control of those state legislators, because they will be drawing the congressional maps for the next 10 years. So this conspiracy theory would have to go very, very, very deep here. And again, The point here, I think, is that there are always going to be irregularities. I don't think anyone denies
So let's
past corruption of the Philadelphias and Detroits and Chicago's of
I
America.
want to make clear that it's
that's
not a
not really what's
conspiracy that some places do, in fact, engage in voter fraud. I mean, that is fact. Americans know that, and that's gone back hundreds and hundreds of years. The question is, to what extent does it actually occur?
Yeah.
But let's talk about another important point. It's something that you and I were originally brought together this summer to talk about with the first version of this policy brief, which, by the way, folks should know, it has since been updated, so reflecting new information as well. And so that's what's wonderful, to be able to come back together almost 5-6 months later. The impact that race has on trust. Jason, you've written about this and about how Black and Latino coalitions have not only played an impact on the election, but how they believe about institutions themselves, whether it is in education or policing. Talk with us a little bit about this.
Yeah, well, one of the things that was striking to me about the election was that, Joe Biden has sold himself as someone who would be able to win back voters who had voted twice for Barack Obama and then switched to Trump, particularly in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And while he seems to have won those states, it wasn't by winning back those voters. Those voters largely stuck with Donald Trump. Joe Biden seems to have won back those states by winning in places like Detroit and Milwaukee and winning voters who didn't turn out for Hillary Clinton, not by winning back those Obama voters. And I think that's an important distinction, because it tells me that this was primarily an election about Donald Trump and not about Republican policies, which still remain, I think, rather popular in the country, even if people were tired of Donald Trump. And so going forward, the Republican Party is going to have to find a way to keep those voters happy. And it's an important, that's not, it's easier said than done. In other words, if you look at people like Susan Collins, who hung on in Maine, or Joni Ernst in Iowa, this was largely because Trump voters turned out to vote for the president and then said, oh, I might as well vote for everybody else down ticket.
You bring up an interesting point, and that is about,
will those voters turn out if Trump isn't on the ticket?
Well, you talk about policies and policies that voters tend to like. The economy, we're energy independent for the very first time, which is huge. Trying to provide people more choice in their health care, even though a lot of folks would disagree with Obamacare, but Republicans have certainly been advocating for more choice, private sector options. And, so how do we get back to the point where we can actually have substantive policy conversations? You certainly didn't get that out of the campaign. You certainly didn't get that out of the debates. We should be having conversations about the good things that we've done in our foreign policy and maybe where we've fallen short. So how do we get back to having those substantive conversations?
Well, I think de-emphasizing race is one way to do that, because it doesn't seem like the Democrats' efforts to talk about, defunding the police and the whole identity politics platform that they were running on to attract Black and Hispanic voters, for example, it doesn't seem to have been particularly successful. Trump did very well with Hispanics, particularly in South Florida and South Texas. He increased his performance among Black voters as well. And I think it's because of his policies. And again, bringing us back to COVID and the current situation, I think it was particularly because of his emphasis on reopening the economy. What you saw under Trump, and just to take a step back,
I appreciate you want to take a step back.
Yeah.
I want to take a moment to look forward and how we empower future leaders to have better conversations, to solve problems, and do it in a substantive way.
Well, I think you need to have honest honest conversations about what's going on. And that gets you back to the media. And to the extent that they are willing to have honest conversations. So we've been having, we had all these police protests over the summer after the George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, and the focus tended to be on policing. Mm-hmm. And as someone who has lived in these neighborhoods and worked in these neighborhoods and covered these neighborhoods, thought it was a little bizarre that the focus would be on policing. In Chicago last year, for example, there were 492 homicides. 3 involved police. 3 out of 492. And Chicago's no outlier here. There are more than 7,000 Black homicides every year, and 1 or 2% involve police. And yet we were having these protests all summer about policing, as if that was the main problem. And when you polled the people who actually lived in these communities, they didn't say that policing was the problem. There was a Gallup poll done in September. 81% of Black residents said that they wanted policing in their communities to either remain the same or increase. Mm-hmm. So what you had was the media, in particular, certain elites in the media, activists and politicians and so forth, trying to keep the focus on police. Mm-hmm. When I think the people who lived in these communities wanted the focus on crime and criminal behavior, as they saw as the main problem. So I think one way to move forward here is to have honest conversations about what is driving the actual problem in these communities. And that's not what we've been having so far. But what I was saying about Trump's emphasis, leading up to the election, leading up to why he increased his performance among minorities, I think that had to do with reopening the economy. What Black and Hispanics had seen under Donald Trump pre-COVID is record low unemployment, record low poverty rates. And so to the extent that the economy was being shut down, Black and Hispanic families were suffering the most. And I think his emphasis on reopening the economy is what led to his uptick in performance in November among those groups.
That's an interesting point. When you look at trust and people's trust in the federal government versus their trust in state and local governments, state and local is so much higher, perhaps because people know folks who serve in that capacity in their own towns. Perhaps it's because there's a school where their child goes or perhaps did go in the past. Is there a takeaway from that? Is there some way that we could better incorporate some of that perhaps small town principles of way of doing business at the federal level to help increase trust?
Perhaps, but I think what you just said in the lead up is what explains that outcome. I mean, in other words, we've long known that people will say, my school is great, but public education is awful. My congressman is great, but Congress is horrible. So it is a sort of local bias that we're seeing there. Perhaps there's some way to extrapolate from that, but I think that's what you're seeing there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's also another part of this poll that I want to touch on because of my time at the State Department, but to give folks a little bit of perspective on this. When we look at our numbers, trust in our government, that they'll do the right thing most, if not all of the time, at 20% today. And we compare that to the world. And I think it was a Pew Research poll. And worldwide, it was 14%. So the US is only slightly higher than how the world feels about that. I would argue that even though we have a lot of questions about our system of government and how things are being handled and how politicians conduct themselves, we are still, of course, so much better off. We still do have transparent institutions and rule of law and freedom of speech, and journalists aren't being imprisoned for reporting what they want to, what they choose to report. So we're still better off. And I say that to kind of remind folks that things may feel ugly sometimes, but we're still in a fairly good spot, at least compared to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I think that's the right perspective. Economists always have a saying, compared to what? So however bad we might think things are right now in the United States, whether it's, trust or some other measure, you have to ask yourself, compared to what? And so yes, obviously compared to many parts of the world, America is still a beacon of hope and in the future and so forth. And so we do have to keep that in mind. But it's also a reminder, the world does look to us, and particularly other democracies look to us. And so we need to be mindful of that right now. And I don't think we're putting our best foot forward right now at this moment. And hopefully things will change.
Sure. Yeah, it's confusing for a lot of foreign leaders who look at a transition right now and think, what on earth is going on? But it's also an opportunity for some foreign governments, unfortunately, like Russia, like China, to try to increase our anxiety and to try to turn Americans on one another. So I think one of the things we all have to be vigilant of is, not taking news at face value. I think our, folks who are watching right now certainly don't do that, but being mindful of the aims and the goals of some foreign governments who merely want chaos in our democracy because it strengthens their hand.
Yeah, obviously, the world is watching. They're always watching, and so yeah, we need to be mindful of that. And again, this has been an unprecedented situation that we find ourselves in right now. Typically, after an election, there's people dial it down, and there is more cooperation in terms of the transition. I think what's complicating things right now is obviously the pandemic. But so there's a lot going on. The world is watching. We need to be mindful of that. But I think we'll be okay. Joe Biden and the incoming administration, he was obviously a vice president for 8 years. He's not a newbie here. He's someone who knows what he needs to do to prepare to become president, and so I'm not too concerned about this, other than the perception, as you mentioned, what we're projecting to the world in terms of how a well-functioning democracy should move forward.
Jason, one of the things I really appreciate about Sylvie's work in the policy circle is the emphasis on finding solutions and things that each of us can do in our daily lives that may not seem like a really big deal, but can perhaps altogether added, improve our standing and improve our ability to trust one another and trust our institutions. What kind of takeaways might you have? Some advice, ideas for people doing that?
Well, I think as a journalist, my advice would be to get outside of your bubble and look at try and understand where other people are coming from. It's an incredibly divided country, and I go back again to that, just COVID and vaccines and how divided we are on something as basic as that. Wearing a mask, whether you should travel for Thanksgiving. We're very, very divided country right now. And I think that people need to understand where their fellow citizens are coming from. And that means looking at news sources outside of your Facebook stream or your Twitter feed or the cable news stations you normally watch. Flip the channel. Take some time to understand where other people are coming from. And I think that would be a good first step in bringing us together, building more trust. Because to the extent that we're only watching or listening to this self-reinforcing views that just sort of make us feel good about what we already believe, I think that's only going to perpetuate some of the divisions we have right now.
Okay, great point. I think Stacy is poised with some questions from folks here. Hi there, Stacy. I can't hear Stacy. Robert, can you?
How about now?
Okay, perfect. Go ahead.
Good. Yeah. So fantastic, interesting conversation. I love you guys going back and forth. And so one of the questions that came up in the chat that I think would be particularly interesting to hear both of you respond to this was, what do we think about social media and the censorship that we saw leading up to, and it's ongoing, but censorship in social media and the reliance, right, that we found amongst particular communities, and like where social media is, there's now sole source of information. A lot of trust issues are coming out of social media. So can you guys cover that a little bit for us?
Sure, Jason, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think there are a couple issues here. One is whether these platforms, Twitter or Facebook, whether they want to consider themselves publishers or just simply platforms for other people to publish their views. And I think they need to make up their minds about this. If they're going to be just platforms for other people to make up their minds, I think leave them alone and let them do that. But if someone submits an op-ed to the Wall Street Journal, we decide whether we run it or not. And if the reader, doesn't like what we're running, they'll read another newspaper. Mm-hmm. And so if Twitter decides to be like the Wall Street Journal, just a place where people put up views and they decide what to publish or what not to publish, I would defend their decision to do that. There are other places people can go for information. What I'm saying is they can't have it both ways.
Mm-hmm.
Say, we're this neutral platform, and at the same time say we're going to edit content we disapprove of. They need to make a decision and be held accountable.
Yeah, and they more than anyone else, or just as much as anyone else, should recall that we do have a First Amendment. And so by censoring people's Twitter accounts, unless it's, calling for, to set a fire in a movie theater, keep it up. Don't take these things down and censor people's Twitter pages. I'm glad to hear that Congress is taking a look at changing some of the regulations that go along with these platforms. I think they have matured far beyond what we originally thought and what Congress originally thought that they could be. So I'm glad to see that. But as an American, as a consumer of news, when I see that Twitter decides to mark someone's tweet as disputed, I ask myself the question, in whose view? Who is that editor behind the curtain that I can't see? And what is this person's training in which this person will claim that this is disputed? I'm an intelligent person. I can figure that out myself. I don't need Twitter to do it for me. So I think it's time to really update the structures in which they were set up.
Well, and I think we've had the issues of the fact checkers and who's checking the fact checkers and the issues that have arisen from that. Again, it just sows so much distrust, I think, at every turn. And so another thing that's come up in the chat that I think is interesting, would love to hear your comments on, is sort of inconsistencies, right, in terms of application of policies, particularly as they have related to COVID and restrictions. It's okay to assemble for one purpose. It's not okay to assemble for another. And so I think some of these inconsistencies, maybe in the application of restrictions and policies, is really breeding some of that discontent. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about what I think some people perceive as a double standard?
Well, it is a double standard. I mean, we've seen example after example of this. So I guess most recently this week, we had the governor of California issuing orders, executive orders. And that's part of the problem here, is that these are supposedly emergency orders. These are not laws that have been passed by a legislature representative of the people of the state. These are emergency powers they've taken on, and we've entrusted them with acting a certain way during emergencies, giving them powers they would not normally have. And what we've seen time and time again is an abuse of these powers. Mayors of cities from Washington to Chicago, doing things that they tell the rest of us we can't do. And again, this gets to the institutional distrust. I think it goes back to that New Jersey figure about COVID vaccines. When you really break it down, that you've had, people saying, social distancing is important or masking is important. But if you want to go to a police protest, never mind. If you want to celebrate Joe Biden's victory, never mind. I mean, the people aren't stupid. The American public isn't stupid. They see the partisanship of the experts and the scientists. And when the politicians come back and say, we need to listen to the science and listen to the experts, they keep this in mind. And the shame here for me is that, or the danger going forward, is that you will get a public that is much less cooperative. I think the first lockdown, people were remarkably cooperative. I personally was shocked that I didn't see more civil disobedience than we saw during the first lockdown. I fully expect if anyone attempts something on the same scale that we saw earlier this year, that you will see much, much less cooperation, and it will be perfectly justified given the hypocrisy we've seen.
Jason, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was one of the poll questions covered as well, and explaining how people, what the outcome is. If people don't trust in their government and in their institutions, people stop cooperating with the law. And maybe next time it won't go as smoothly as some situations have gone so far. We've got to be on the lookout for that. That's a dangerous place to go.
It is. And you guys point out, in the brief, we really talk about that's a foundational issue, right? You have to believe that the entities, if you will, imposing these restrictions are trustworthy.
And they're fair, yes.
Right, and they're fair, consistent. And so you see that correlation, right, between your trust gets lower and then that willingness to comply, right? Because you don't really feel like maybe they have your best interest at heart. I think one of the encouraging sort of statistics and findings in the brief was the trust that people have in small businesses and in that local institutions to deal with this. We have a number of people that are participating tonight who are responsible for businesses and that they're leaders in their community. I think it would be great if each of you could kind of share maybe a bright spot or some thoughts on what each of these individuals on this call as leaders can do to start rebuilding trust in their community.
You can go ahead, Heather.
Okay, thanks. I think I'd start with, for those who run organizations, whether they're big or small, it's always risky to put yourself out in front of your team, but it's important to talk to your team, your leaders. You know that better than anyone, but not to delve so much into politics, but rather say, here at this office, if we have disagreements, we're going to treat one another with decency and respect. And here are the founding principles of my company. And through that position of power and influence that you or family members or friends have, that goes down, that trickles down, and people see that you are doing the right thing. If there's ever an instance in your company in which something does go wrong, I think it's important to stand up and take responsibility for it right away and not shirk that responsibility. If there's a situation that becomes public, I think it's important to consider putting your leader out front to quickly communicate with the public what happened and what you're doing to fix it. As Americans, we can all understand that people make mistakes, things go wrong, things break. But when someone comes out and can honestly and succinctly explain what went wrong, you, your organization, and your community, I think will be so much better off.
Yeah, that's such a great point too, Heather, about just own it, right?
Yeah.
Own it, be transparent. I think that goes a long way in that community setting. Jason, what do you think?
I've been very disappointed in how the lockdown to me was so devastating. I think we lost 23 million jobs in this country. A lot of those came back last quarter. We had a record economic quarter. third quarter. The fourth quarter looks very strong. And the idea that we still have people out there talking about doing a second lockdown, I find just very, very, very disturbing. You drive around suburbs, cities, and you look at what's boarded up, what's closed. These small businesses are the heart and soul of this country, and they've been devastated. And the idea that you know the president-elect has surrounded himself with people who are considering another lockdown, that would have no problem with telling everyone to stay home and wait for a government check to keep you going, I find very, very, very disturbing. And it's something I really do worry about. You know, that there's talk of another stimulus, but I want to make sure that the right incentives are in place for that stimulus, that they're not paying people more to stay home than to go back to work. That businesses who, as Heather just described, are acting in good faith, have the liability protections that they need to reopen and feel secure in reopening. We need to get this right, but I think we know how to get it wrong, and getting it wrong was how we did it the first time with these massive one-size-fits-all lockdowns that just devastated this country.
Yeah, and if I can just add, I don't know to what extent folks have traveled around the country or hopped in an Uber or gone to a restaurant, but they are struggling, and this is not sustainable.
No.
I don't know how we continue to pay Medicare, Medicaid, all of our government programs without people working. So I almost think that once we get through this peak period right now, because things we know are peaking significantly across our country, and maybe it's a week, maybe 2 weeks from now, but it is incumbent upon us as Americans to think not just about our own families, but to think about the future of our country. And what does that look like? It looks like if your family or if you yourself are not immunocompromised and you are able-bodied and have the ability to get out and go to work, I think we almost need a campaign where we're making that case to the American public. Otherwise, a lot more of us are going to be out of jobs, and more businesses are going to fold. And that we don't want to see that.
No, and I think that you guys both bring up, a couple of really valuable points for us. And I want to thank you both for sharing your insight and your perspective, because I do think it's imperative on all of us to determine what role do we have to play, right? How can we stand up for local businesses? How can we support them during this crisis? And importantly, I think, how do we have more constructive conversations like this one? And so again, Heather, Jason, you're both two of my favorites, and we're so lucky to have you both. And we're grateful for you during this time of year in particular. But now that we've had two opportunities to hear your perspective, we're even more grateful to hear you weigh in. And for everyone that's participating in this call, we really want to encourage you. Jason said, get out of your bubble. Well, utilize the Policy Circle brief. It's a great opportunity to convene your family, your friends, your colleagues. Do a Zoom with your friends from college, and let's have it be purposeful. This brief has a framework, it has steps you can take, and I think you'll be surprised by the level of engagement that you're going to get from those around you, and maybe some great solutions could be arrived at. So I just want to encourage everyone to engage. If you know some people in your life that might enjoy being part of the Policy Circle, we'll put our website up here. I think everybody on this call knows it, but please share it with some others in your life so that they can have an opportunity to join us. And I also want to highlight, we have one more this year, Move the Needle experience coming up on December 9th. And this is going to be about financial freedom. So financial literacy. We have some incredible folks lined up for this conversation. And lastly, we want to say thank you. Thank you for being supporters. Thank you for having these important conversations. And until we gather together again, I want to encourage you to stay curious and change the conversation. Thanks for joining us, and have a great night.